Hi everyone. My name is Yen and this is Megan. We are here from Sisters of Frida. Um, Sisters of Frida is a disabled feminist org for disabled women and genderqueer people. And I'll just let Megan introduce herself.
Yeah, I'm Megan. I'm a disabled person based in Bristol. So I'm with Yen on the steering group of Sisters of Frida, and then I'm also director of Bristol Disability Equality Forum. So really happy to be here. And then I'll pass back over to Yen to introduce herself personally.
My name's Yen. I'm a disabled person. I'm an artist. I'm on the steering group of Sisters of Frida. I'm also part of ESCA Sisters. Both of those groups are like sisters, not CIS-ters. Um, and I'm also an abuse survivor. So First of all, I just wanted to start with a care warning for this section, which is really important. Feel free to mute while you see us on screen and then unmute when we leave if this would be triggering for you. The care warning is that this speech mentions domestic, familial, institutional, and sexual abuse, as well as lived experience of abuse. Um, yeah, so today, uh,
Yeah. Um,
while there are obviously many consequences that will be experienced as a result of these so called welfare reforms, we want to discuss an often overlooked consequence of cutting disability benefits: the increase in domestic, partner, familial, family, and institutional abuse experienced by disabled people. It is an often overlooked part of the experience of disabled people. However, looking at the stats and hearing disabled people's stories is not an uncommon experience. The government cutting some 6.5 billion from ill and disabled people by 2029 to 30 is repeating the pattern of entrapping more disabled people in abuse, and the financial dependence it creates will make it difficult for survivors to leave. For many disabled people living with abuse in the UK, disability benefits are not just a lifeline, they are a difference between survival and the ability to escape or the daily reality of being trapped with your abuser.
Thanks, Yen. So I'm just going to talk through some kind of key statistics that, will kind of almost set the scene for what we're talking about here today. And obviously, these are, kind of this can be felt by a lot of disabled people, but these are the just on the pure looking at them, these are the stats that are involved. So in the year ending in March 2019, 1 in 20 non-disabled adults experienced domestic abuse, whereas one in 7 disabled adults experienced domestic abuse in the same year. Disabled women and men were more than twice as likely to have experienced domestic abuse than non disabled people, with higher rates of abuse among women. Genderqueer and trans people experience high rates of domestic and familial abuse. In the UK, 43% of trans and non binary respondents report abuse from family members. Those who are disabled are even more vulnerable to abuse. 93% of disabled people who have attempted to access transition related healthcare have experienced delays compared to 85% non disabled people. All these stats have, something very similar in common. So, whilst abuse, violence, and discrimination may be occurring for, a large proportion of people, when an individual is also a disabled person, it increases the likelihood of that abuse, violence, or discrimination occurring. Support like benefits goes some way to addressing these discrepancies. I'm obviously appreciating that it doesn't go all the way, but as Yen mentioned, it can be, or access to support and access to benefits can be the difference between survival and the ability to escape for many, many disabled people.
Financial dependence increases vulnerability to abuse, so cutting benefits forces many disabled people to rely more on family members or caregivers for basic needs. This increases the power balance in relationships, making disabled people more susceptible to coercion, control, and abuse. Universal credit and its health component, sometimes in the media they call it the health top up, sometimes it's called the new ESA, are means tested as a couple or family. So if you, example, if your abusive partner earns over the threshold, you cannot access it. However, PIP is available to all disabled people to apply for, however, very hard to get. So crucial for the chance at independence for disabled people. Then, universal credit and its health component is vital for people who have escaped domestic abuse. Abusers use tactics of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and physical neglect against disabled people, like withholding money, food, medical care, transportation, and using inaccessible housing as a form of manipulation and control. This is often an issue for disabled people because when reporting abuse, sometimes the method of abuse doesn't tick what people see as normal abuse within a relationship and can cause problems with getting across what is actually happening.
Mm. So these cuts will increase both poverty and abuse. So, poverty and particularly domestic abuse are deeply interconnected, each exacerbating the effects of the other. And poverty heightens stress within households, so it leads to that increase in violence, neglect, and emotional abuse. Many disabled people, especially families on disability benefits, are already living in poverty and are not able to afford enough food and heating. Research indicates that 14% of women in poverty have faced extensive violence and abuse compared to 6% of women not in poverty. And obviously, as we mentioned earlier, when the identity of being a disabled person is also added in, the rates and the stats shoot up. So any cuts to benefits or those lifelines of support will inevitably increase both the experience of poverty and the experience of abuse.
We want to also bring in institutional and elderly abuse and neglect because this is an area that's often not spoken about within like disability rights. Um, it is really difficult for people within institutions to participate like this. Um, So, care settings and institutions already pose risks for abuse. Disabled individuals in care homes face neglect, mistreatment, and exploitation. Financial instability and benefit cuts limit disabled people's ability to seek help or leave abusive institutions. Overcrowded and underregulated facilities are breeding grounds for neglect, mistreatment, and even physical and emotional abuse. So, the NHS Digital Safeguarding Adults Collection for the year ending March 2022 reported 147,000 Section 42 inquiries. So, these are formal investigations where an adult may be experiencing or at risk of abuse or neglect. And of these, 34% were concerning risks in nursing homes or residential care homes, including a substantial amount. Yeah, so this was a substantial amount of abuse within institutions. Um, it's important to note that care home residents um, face barriers in accessing helplines, internet, and outside help, which leads to underreporting. And the House of Lords has acknowledged, especially the underreporting of elderly abuse, particularly among those with dementia.
And then I think something that's already been touched on a number of times is by removing the lifelines to support, the barriers that are already in place will only increase to reporting and escaping abuse. So many disabled people already face so many challenges in reporting abuse due to, just off the top of my head, communication barriers, the lack of accessible services, the fear and the reality of not being believed. Reduced financial independence means fewer options for leaving abusive environments, especially if alternative housing or care is unaffordable. So there's a stat that we found, which was based on freedom of information requests to 325 local authorities. It showed that there are an estimated 20,000 people on English local authority waiting lists for a fully wheelchair accessible home. A further 104,000 people are waiting for an accessible or adaptable home. At the current rate of building, a wheelchair user joining the list today could wait up to 47 years for a new home that meets their needs. And so, if you're someone who is a wheelchair user who is looking to escape a situation, obviously that doesn't leave you facing with a number of options or perceived options. Legal and social services are designed to support abuse survivors, often require financial means to access transportation, legal aid, or advocacy, resources that disability benefits help provide, but are obviously being cut and cut and cut further. Not just under these welfare reforms, but we've seen, things like legal aid be reduced over the last 14, 15 years to really, really low levels. So there are innumerable barriers already to reporting and escaping abuse, and these cuts will only exacerbate that.
Um, so I'm about to share some lived experience, just to ground all these stats in reality, and in the everyday kind of barriers that are faced. Um, you have to excuse me, it might take me, I might need some little breaks here and there. This is the first time I've spoken about this to people other than like people close to me. Uh, I am one of four disabled or chronically ill friends of mine who are or had been living with abuse. One escaped and are building their new life now. They asked me to read this quote for you today. Knowing I could access universal credit and PIP gave me the strength to know I could leave a toxic and abusive situation. I know for sure that if that wasn't available to me, I'd feel trapped still. One of my friends is still living with their abuser, not by choice, but because of the barriers built into the social care benefits and accessible housing system have kept them trapped. One is no longer with us, and I miss them every day. And then there is me. And I'm here today to tell you that without disability benefits, I would also not be here today. Mhm. Okay, sorry, give me 1 second. I came here to the UK 5.5 years ago, and I've lived here on a spousal visa until very recently. I am now in my own safe place, um, which I got here through applying for the domestic abuse concessions route, and I now have my own permanent visa. Um, this is some of my story and the barriers to safety that I faced along the way. Life as a disabled immigrant, I think, is a lot different to how people think it is. Disabled immigrants who are pre-permanent status. So that's usually 5 to 10 years, depending on the country you come from or how you came here. So, for example, if you come here as a refugee, it's at least 10 years. Um, Anyone who is pre permanent leave to remain, so pre permission to stay here permanently. We get a little card, and on the back it says NRPF, which means no resource to public funds. That means we cannot apply for benefits. Um, we cannot apply for uh, social care. So, like if you're disabled, you can't access council social care. Um, all of this came in 2012 under Theresa May to create a hostile environment, and it has definitely done that. If someone is here on a spousal visa living with abuse, The terms of their visa don't change. Legally, they still are not allowed to live separately from their partner. I lived under those conditions for, um, yeah, quite a few years. My support network is back home in Australia, over the other side of the world, and I am not well enough to travel. Disabled abuse often looks really different and can fall into the gray area when you're trying to report it. The abuses, for example, can keep you trapped in inaccessible housing, keep your mobility aids out of reach, neglect you, and create isolation. The first home I lived here in the UK, lived in here in the UK, as I became more disabled, I was trapped upstairs. The kitchen was downstairs. There were bathrooms upstairs, but I couldn't use them myself. One time I called a neighbor to come over. Um, I was shaking with shame. I explained to this neighbor that I had fleas. My dog had fleas. My bed had fleas. I had not bathed in 6 weeks and my bedding was filthy. I called the council many times and asked for a social worker. Every time they told me that's not how it works, you have to be referred by services. I explained I have no services. I need a social worker to access services. Thus, this meant my first attempt to leave in 2021 was failed. In the second home I lived in, I was trapped inside by heavy fire doors and bedbound after catching COVID from my partner. But I finally had access to social care as mental health referred me to a social worker who used human rights law to argue my case. When things escalated and I had to call the police, my social worker and I applied to get me off my spousal visa and onto my own so that I could then ask for the support of benefits and council housing. We looked at temporary housing because this process takes months and months, but turns out in the whole north of the UK, there are only two refuges that will take pre-settled immigrants, so immigrants who don't have permission to stay long term, and obviously they're full. Um, it also turned out that there were zero refuges that could take wheelchair user. This is not just a problem in the north. I have called all over London for a friend previously in a similar situation, to be told by the really big gender violence organizations that, well, disability is a really big gap in our skill set and knowledge. So, like, if you find anyone, um, let us know who we should refer disabled people to. When I spoke to actual staff on the ground in refuges, they said to me, frankly, no one will take a wheelchair user. It's not just wheelchair users, there's a lack of accessible refuges and safe spaces for immunocompromised, bedbound, people with mental health conditions, and those needing care. While waiting for my visa those months, I survived on donations and support from mostly faraway friends in a group chat I called Escape Squad, and fundraising championed by my online disabled friends. I finally got my visa and was able to access basic universal credit and then rehoused. Um, it wasn't smooth sailing from there. I was rehoused into a place that for the last year was a drug den, and it was left in quite a state. I had only like the bare concrete, which was crumbling in places. There was water leaking into the walls. At that point, I only had access to basic universal credit, so I couldn't afford enough heating. Um, the health component top up or new ESA is actually quite hard to get. There's a 28-page form and work capability assessment for people who can't work in order to get it. So I went through the coldest of the winter months where inside the house was 7 degrees and below. I now have flooring and warmth, and I'm hoping to get PIP. If I get PIP, I will be able to stop rationing my non NHS medications, which means I'll have less seizures. I'll be able to stop halving my food shop and afford all my very basic living costs and bills. My story is not an isolated one, it is in no way exceptional. I'm 1 in 7 disabled adults. The only thing exceptional about this is that I made it out. I lucked out with a social worker who has and understands chronic illness and disability themselves, and people who fought for and with me. Disability benefits saves lives, cuts kill us.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you for sharing it. And I've been watching the live chat, and everyone is just sending absolute love and solidarity to you.
Oh, thank you.
So just to tie up and just bring together so much of what Yen has talked about and what we've covered, cutting disability benefits doesn't just harm individuals financially, it creates dangerous conditions where abuse becomes more frequent and harder to escape. Cutting disability benefits is not just a financial issue, it's a social and human rights issue. Disabled people deserve financial security, independence, and safety. We should not be, once again, paying the price for bad economic decisions, especially as the DWP's own figures show how fraud in PIP is very low. Society must protect and support disabled people rather than pushing them into dangerous situations. This is a political choice, and it is one that can be undone. To reduce the high rates of abuse against disabled people, protecting and expanding disability benefits is a human rights necessity. No one should have to believe between their no one should have to choose between their safety and their survival. Thank you.